comics, video games, audio dramas, every medium imaginable. But we're not going to talk about any of those stories today.
Aww.
Instead, we'll be talking about all the stories that, for one reason or another, didn't happen. We're going to look back on some of the earliest conceptions that George Lucas had for the Star Wars saga. We're going to talk about some of the TV projects that he had that didn't get made for one reason or another. And yes, we will touch a little bit on what he had planned for the sequel trilogy before he sold to Disney.
We can't talk about the hunt for Ben Solo?
No hunt for Ben Solo today. Maybe next year.
There we go, Ben Solo right here.
So we begin in 1973 when George Lucas is wrapping up production on American Graffiti, his second feature film, and he's deciding what he wants to do next. He's deciding what movie is going to follow up this slapstick comedy set in the 1950s, and he decides that what he wants to do is make a space opera. He's inspired by the movie serials and adventure comics that he enjoyed as a kid, so he wants to put his own spin on what was a mostly defunct subgenre. So he sits down and begins working on an ambitious new project called the Journal of the Whills. And what we have here is actually like the earliest bit of proto-Star Wars storytelling. It's part of this sort of 2-page story concept for the Journal of the Whills. It begins like this. This is the story of Mace Windy, a revered Jedi Bendu of Ofuchi, as related to us by C.J. Thorpe, a Padawan learner to the famed Jedi. And it goes on from there. We get some backstory about how C.J. Thorpe starts training with Mace Windy when he's 16, but they get banished from the royal court because there are enemies that think that Mace Windy might be more powerful than the imperial ruler. And then we jump ahead about 4 years in time. They're on a mission together when they're pulled away to a mysterious meeting. And that's it. That's as far as Lucas gets with this version of the saga before he decides, it's not really working for me, I'm gonna try again. But even in this like very, very early abandoned idea, we see some of the conceptions for things that will be in the Star Wars saga. The Empire exists, as do the Jedi. We even get the term Padawan in there, which if you know, Padawan doesn't show up in the movies until 1999, 26 years later. There it is in 1973. And of course, same goes for Mace Windy, who becomes Mace Windu, played so memorably by Sam Jackson in the prequels. And C.J. Thorpe is even kind of an early version of a beloved Star Wars character. We learn later on in the outline that his full name is Chewie 2 Thorpe of Kissel. Where that J comes from, not entirely sure. And his father is Han Dardell Thorpe, chief pilot of the renowned galactic cruiser Tarnak. So even from the very beginning, Han and Chewie are linked, just with a lot of details still to be figured out. So after abandoning this version of the Journal of the Whills, George Lucas starts over. And from 1973 until 1976, he slowly develops the script for what will become Star Wars, later subtitled A New Hope. And as he develops this script, he realizes he's got way more material than could ever fit into one movie. So he begins to loosely plot out a larger multi-picture saga, and even creates a very, very rough outline for what a 12-movie series could be. In this outline that you see here, the original Star Wars movie, A New Hope, is not episode 4, it's not even episode 1, it's episode 6. Episode 1 is called A Prelude, episode 2, 3, and 4 are listed as a Clone Wars trilogy, episode 5 says it's called the epilogue/prologue, 6, 7, and 8 are the original trilogy, 9, 10, and 11 are left blank, and 12 just says conclusion. So clearly he's dreaming big, even if there's still a lot of details to be figured out. And of course he's right to do so. You know, Star Wars opens in May 1977, almost 50 years ago now, and it's this massive hit, and it opens the floodgates for more stories with these characters in this universe. And so after a couple months of rest, Lucas gets to work on his first Star Wars sequel, a movie the world calls Star Wars 2, but he calls The Empire Strikes Back. Now, making Star Wars had not been a very pleasant experience for George Lucas. He faced a lot of pressures and stresses from just about every direction imaginable, even checking himself into the hospital at one point because he was experiencing chest pains. Not a heart attack, but still scary enough. So for Empire, he decides he wants to take a step back. He wants to just kind of be the executive producer, overseeing everything without needing to be there hands-on day to day. So he brings back Gary Kurtz to serve as producer, just as he did for Star Wars and American Graffiti. He hires his film school teacher, Irvin Kershner, to direct, And to write the script, he hires veteran science fiction author Lee Brackett. And Lee Brackett and George Lucas, they meet at the end of 1977 for a week's worth of story meetings, and she turns in her first and only draft of the script in 1978. Sadly, she dies about a month after turning in the script from cancer. But unlike the first movie, where the first few drafts of Star Wars were radically different from what we saw in the final movie, Empire Strikes Back, the first draft of the script, more or less follows the story of the original movie. We start with the Empire attacking the rebels on an ice planet. Luke then trains with an old Jedi Master on a bog world. Han and Leia flee the Empire and fall in love in an asteroid field, and the whole thing ends with Luke Skywalker fighting Darth Vader on a city in the clouds. But there are a couple of key differences that sort of hint at an alternate version of what the Star Wars saga might have been. For one, this doesn't happen. Han Solo does not get frozen in carbonite at the end of the movie, excuse me. Instead, in this version, we learn that Han has a mysterious stepfather who's a galactic power broker. And there's this whole subplot of Leia trying to get him to recruit this wayward stepfather to join the rebellion and help their cause, but he's reluctant to do so because of their past together. In the end, he does eventually agree to do it, and the movie ends with Han and Chewie flying off in search of this mysterious stepfather figure, setting up a third movie. More impactful, though, is the second major difference, which relates to not just one of the biggest moments in the movie, but one of the biggest moments in movie history. If you don't know, spoiler alert. That's right, at no point in this first draft does Darth Vader reveal himself to be Luke Skywalker's father.
Not true. That's impossible.
Hard as it may be to believe, Empire's biggest moment, a moment that comes to define the saga and movie history, is nowhere to be found in the original conception of the movie. Instead, Luke's father actually appears as a separate character, as a Force ghost, offering him some Jedi wisdom alongside Ben Kenobi and Midge, who's an early version of Yoda. He also tells Luke that he's got a long-lost sister out there, something that we're going to put a pin in for right now. These days, if you ask George Lucas, he'll tell you that this was always the plan, that Darth Vader was always going to be Luke Skywalker's father, and he just didn't tell Lee Brackett because he was saving the surprise for a later movie and didn't want to even hint at it in Empire. Personally, I'm not convinced. I think it's pretty clear that when Obi-Wan is talking to Luke in A New Hope, he's talking about two different guys when he's talking about when Luke's dad died. There's Luke's father, Anakin Skywalker, and his betrayer, a Jedi Knight with the first name Darth and the last name Vader, which is why Ben calls him Darth on the Death Star when they meet later in the movie. And I think this first draft of the movie is setting up a version of the story where Anakin and Vader are separate people. And the idea that Luke would want revenge against the man who murdered his father is still compelling, as is the backstory that Anakin Skywalker was betrayed by his ally, the Jedi Knight Darth Vader. And it's easy to imagine George Lucas and Lee Brackett planning out an early version of the saga around this idea. That said, the twist that Luke's father is Darth Vader is obviously better. Yes, that is a real poster from Revenge of the Sith.
Yeah.
You can't believe it. They were having a lot of fun at the Lucasfilm in 2005. And Lucas decides to move this idea into Empire Strikes Back, or more realistically, he comes up with it when he takes over writing the script in mid-1978. Now, as for the mention that Luke has a sister, that his father was going to make this reveal to him, that is something that Lucas planned to always include in the movie, this reveal that there's another hero out there, that Luke has a sister. It was both to sort of tease out the future of the story, where someone who wasn't yet involved in the story would join the fight, and also to sow a seed of doubt in the audience's mind that Luke might not survive to the end of the movie. But he hadn't decided yet who the sister was going to be. He hadn't invented the character yet. So when he takes over writing, him and Lawrence Kasdan put the dialogue into Yoda's mouth, and they have him refer to a mysterious other. And that gives them the freedom, if they want it, to change their mind going forward in the subsequent movies. But of course, they went back to the original idea. Luke has a sister, it's Princess Leia, as we find out in Return of the Jedi. And what all these evolutions of this script did was help focus the saga. right? It's during the development of Empire that Star Wars truly becomes the Skywalker family drama. And it gives Lucas a clear emotional core to build around when he decides to end the saga with the next movie. Vader's redemption can be the climax to the story. And he would remain adamant for many, many years that this was the end of the saga. Even when he went back and eventually told more stories about Anakin Skywalker's fall to the dark side with the prequels, he always was adamant that the story would end with Return of the Jedi. He was happy to let the licensing arm tell more stories in books and comics, even video games. But according to him, quote, the movies were the story of Anakin Skywalker and Luke Skywalker, and when Luke saves the galaxy and redeems his father, that's where the story ends, end quote. But that's not to say he was done telling Star Wars stories. As the prequel trilogy wrapped up in 2005, he was busy making plans to fill in the gaps left by his 6-movie saga, but this time he planned to do it on television. Initially, he wanted to make 2 Star Wars series, an animated Clone Wars series, and a live-action series set between episodes 3 and 4. And as you can see from this poster from Toy Fair from about almost 20 years ago now, he hoped to have them on the air by the end of the decade. We know that didn't quite happen. Worked for one, not so much for the other. Initially, he decides to start working on Clone Wars first, believing correctly that it would be easier to get up and running, and development on that show even began before Revenge of the Sith was in theaters. But at the same time, he was still working on his live-action series. So in February of 2006, George and his longtime producing partner, Rick McCallum, began searching the world for writers to work on this series, and they interviewed hundreds of writers from all around the globe, eventually settling on 8. Terry Cafola, Chris Chibnall, Louise Fox, Tony McNamara, Fiona Series, Matthew Graham, Stephen Scalia, and Ronald D. Moore. And Lucas would hold story conferences with these writers at Skywalker Ranch throughout 2008, 2009, and 2010. Initially, the plan was to develop about 25 scripts before they sought out a network to co-produce the series. But they were having so much fun, they decided to just double that number to 50. And at the same time, he had a small art department also working on the project. First, they were just churning out ideas to inspire the writers, and then later they started creating pieces that were based on the evolving scripts. And it was during this design period that designs that would eventually become the Pikes and the Bounty Hunter Embo were created. So the tone of the series was also said to be much darker than the movies. McCallum said of the scripts, quote, these were dark, they were sexy, they were violent, they were just absolutely wonderful, complicated, challenging. I mean, it would have blown up the whole Star Wars universe, and Disney definitely never would have offered to buy it from George. So the show had the working title Underworld, which reflected both the primary location of the series, which was the lower levels of Coruscant, and the crime families who operated down there that would have been at the center of the story. The series would have featured gangsters and bounty hunters alongside sympathetic Imperials and dangerous rebels, like Saw Gerrera, who we have since seen in the Clone Wars, Rogue One, and Andor, and several other Star Wars modern projects. Saw was developed for this series, and his portrayal in those modern projects has largely remained true to the conception of him for Underworld. He's the extremist rebel who makes the rest of the Rebel Alliance squeamish with his tactics. Mm-hmm. Another rebel connection that was set for the series was the Church of the Force. This was an underground movement of people who couldn't use the Force but still worshipped the Jedi, even after the Emperor's Purge. And the Church of the Force also would have served the double purpose of spreading rebel information through the galaxy. Yeah. But of course, rebel activity on Coruscant is always going to catch the attention of the Empire, and in a 2-part episode written by Ronald D. Moore, we would have seen Darth Vader enter the lower levels to shut down an insurrection. And Vader's master also would have featured in the series. Despite his importance to the saga, the Emperor's backstory has always largely remained a mystery in the movies. So Lucas worked with the writers to develop a story that would reveal some of Palpatine's past, including his first name, which we now know, thanks to work done on the series, is Sheev. But they also came up with a lot more than just his name. So we learned these details about the Emperor's backstory from Cory Barlog, who was one of the creative directors on the God of War video games. He also worked on a video game called Star Wars 1313 that was developed to tie in with Underworld. It also was sadly canceled, but because the show and the game were supposed to tie in so closely together, he got to read some of the scripts for the series, including the ones that explored Palpatine's backstory. And here's what he said about what he read. Quote, "It was the most mind-blowing thing I'd ever experienced. I cared about the Emperor. They made the Emperor a sympathetic figure who was wronged by this effing heartless woman. She's this hardcore gangster and she just totally destroyed him as a person. I almost cried while reading this. This is the Emperor, the lightning out of the fingers Emperor. That's something magical." End quote. So, unsurprisingly, when he said that, there was some outcry from Star Wars fans about what this series might have revealed about Palpatine and what it might have been saying with that reveal. And I think it's worth pausing here to say, it's impossible to know what the story actually would have looked like had it played out. Hearing someone remember what they read in a script several years earlier is obviously very, very different from seeing an actual episode of a TV show. And as we've already seen today with Empire and Journal of the Wills, there's a lot of evolutions to these things before they actually reach the screen. So there's a chance that Palpatine's backstory might have looked very, very different if and when it was actually told. And that's something to keep in mind with all of the stuff that we're talking about. We have way less than half the story here. And what we imagine in our heads when we think about these untold stories is likely very different from what they would have looked like had they actually made it to screen. So getting back to the story of Underworld, the show, Palpatine and Vader weren't the only familiar faces who would have shown up in the series. Underworld would have shown us some key moments from Han Solo's early life, including winning the Millennium Falcon from Lando, and how he met Chewbacca. And Boba Fett was also expected to appear with one of this weekend's guests, Daniel Logan, expected to reprise the role just as he had done in Attack of the Clones. Now, despite, or perhaps because of his popularity, Boba has had a lot of near misses with prominent roles in Star Wars projects through the years. He was originally slated to appear in Revenge of the Sith. This is some concept art of what that might have looked like before Lucas decided to cut those scenes because he wanted to make sure that movie had a laser-like focus on Anakin. And even if we go back to the original trilogy, they were considering giving him a very direct tie to the Skywalker family. According to the late, great Marcia Lucas, who was George's ex-wife and one of the editors on the original trilogy, they briefly considered making Boba Fett and Darth Vader stepbrothers, but they quickly moved off this idea, deeming it to be too hokey even for the 80s. In Underworld, we would have seen Boba doing what he does best, tracking down bounties with his jetpack. And Boba wouldn't have been the only clone of Jango Fett to appear in the series. Underworld also would have explored what happened to the clone army after the end of the Clone Wars. So when he was developing the prequel trilogy, Lucas had originally planned to just have the clone army evolve into the stormtrooper legions of the Empire. But as he was developing the Clone Wars and Underworld, he realized that because the clones had shown they could show so much independent thought under the Jedi's leadership, Palpatine wouldn't trust them to be his military anymore. So the stormtroopers were turned into recruits, and the clones became something of a discarded generation. And we see little hints at this in stories that do exist. The Clone Bar 79s, which shows up in the Clone Wars and the Bad Batch, was also something that was originally developed for this series. And everything that we're talking about is really just scratching the surface of what was planned for Star Wars Underworld. Some other concepts that have gone on to appear in other stories include kyber crystals powering the Death Star, the idea of Empire Day, Palpatine turning the Jedi Temple into the Imperial Palace, and the droid bounty hunter High Singer. So clearly a lot of work was done on this series, so why didn't it get made? The answer, of course, is money. The writers followed George's instruction to not concern themselves with the budget as they were writing their scripts. So the show was basically impossible to shoot using the traditional TV methods at the time. According to Rick McCallum, every episode would have cost around $40 million to make. And he needed to get that down to just $5 million per episode. Still, they push forward. In 2010, George Lucas hires the visual effects company Stargate Studios to create some test footage for Underworld that kind of showcases the tone and the setting of the series. And this footage is surprisingly available online to watch, and we will take a little look at some of it right now.
Rebel activity in the area. You two move along. This area is threat level orange. Move along.
Hello. I was sent from Alistair. Thank you. Thank you. We could not have done this without you.
If you're looking to pick up kind of a unique collectible this weekend, I think it's Matthew Wood who voices the Stormtroopers in this. So you could print off a screenshot from this and get him to sign it. I don't think he signed a whole lot of those. Also worth noting.
No, he's not canceled. We canceled him this weekend.
Oh, did? Darn, I thought he was still here. Dave Collins canceled.
They both.
Oh, darn.
Yeah.
I was hoping to meet both of them. Anyway, it's worth noting that this is just test footage. It is not from an episode of the show. No episodes of the show were produced. It's not even really based on a script for the show. It's just supposed to show the tone and the setting of the series to give networks an idea of what the show might have been. Lucas and McCallum did shop that around to different networks. ABC and the Sci-Fi Network both passed on it. But the closest it came to finding a home was with HBO. So the CEO of HBO at the time was this guy named Chris Albrecht. And he was apparently interested in producing the series if he could find a European partner to co-finance the show, similar to what they had done with the HBO original Rome. And according to McCallum, he was all set to visit them at Skywalker Ranch. They were going to have a meeting where they plotted all of this out. But the weekend before he was going to go to Skywalker Ranch, he was arrested in Las Vegas and quickly fired from HBO, and his replacements were not interested in doing a Star Wars live action series at the time. The final nail in the coffin for Underworld was then Lucas's inability to get a new state-of-the-art digital production facility built in Marin County in California. He wanted to call this facility Grady Ranch, and he had purchased some land out there. He'd gotten the backings he needed from local governments, but the residents of the area did not want to have this in their backyard, so they blocked construction for several years. And in April 2012, Lucas just gave up on the whole project and sold the land. And that was kind of the beginning of the end of that era of Lucasfilm, because a month later, he hired Kathleen Kennedy to run the company, and shortly after that, he began negotiations with Bob Iger to sell the company to Disney. Now, when Disney bought Lucasfilm in October 2012, the Underworld scripts were included in the deal, which is why we've seen so many of those concepts show up in other places. But the series is practically guaranteed never to get made. And Underworld wasn't the only Star Wars production that was caught up in this changeover from Disney to Lucasfilm. The Clone Wars, when Lucasfilm was bought, was already airing its 5th season. But once that season ended in the spring of 2013, the new regime announced that the series would be ending because they were overhauling the current slate of Star Wars productions in advance of beginning work on the new movies. The series would, of course, still release 2 more seasons, one in 2014 and a revival in 2020, but there were a lot more episode concepts that were developed before the sale that never made it to screen. One of those was an arc that would have featured R2-D2 and Captain Rex on a mission together. R2 would have intervened in a friendly dispute between the military clones and the Air Force clones. And this would have led to a Top Gun style chase with R2 and Rex versus another clone and droid duo. They would have ultimately crashed on one of Ryloth's moons, and the adventure would have continued from there. There was also a story where the Bad Batch would have accompanied Yoda to Kashyyyk to help the Wookiees in their fight against the Separatists, who were led by a Trandoshan warrior at the time. The arc would have explored the deep spiritual connection the Wookiees have with the Forest, and given some context to Yoda's line about having good relations with the Wookiees in Episode 3. And there was another arc that would have reunited Ahsoka with the Jedi before the Siege of Mandalore. They would have been investigating something happening in the Coruscant underworld. Again, this was in development at the same time as the other series, so there would have been some sharing of ideas there. The investigation would have taken them all deep into the Jedi Temple, where it would have been revealed that the Jedi Temple is built on top of some ancient Sith shrines, and the shrine was defended by some giant kaiju-like creatures. And it all would have built to a moment where Ahsoka is using her lightsaber to weld the door to the holocron vault shut, while Darth Sidious is on the other side trying to use his Force lightning to force open the door. The two never would have actually come face to face, but this is as close to an open confrontation as we would have seen between the two of them. And there was also plans for an arc for Padme, where she would have been trying to end the Clone Wars diplomatically. She would have traveled to many different separatist worlds, making agreements with different leaders, and eventually getting to the point where it seemed like she might succeed at ending the Clone Wars. But then General Grievous would attack Coruscant, kidnap Palpatine, and all of her hard work would have been rendered useless. Now, unlike a lot of the concepts we've talked about for Clone Wars, this was something they developed as one of a couple of different ideas to tie into Revenge of the Sith. And even before the show was canceled, they had decided to go in a different direction for that Revenge of the Sith tie-in. And so the arc, had it been made, likely would have been very different. And it also, some of those ideas were repurposed into other stories. And of course, sticking with the grand tradition of Boba Fett stories almost making it to screen, there was also a planned arc where Cad Bane would have taken Boba Fett under his wing to train him to be a better bounty hunter. But of course, Bane has an ulterior motive, as always. Bane and Jango Fett had a rivalry before Jango's death over who was the greatest bounty hunter. But they never got to find out because Mace Windu cut Jango Fett's head off in the Geonosian arena. So Bane decides what he's going to do is train Boba Fett to be just as good as his father, so he can find out. The arc would have involved a lot of other bounty hunters that we saw in the Clone Wars, including Aurra Sing and Bossk, Blotz-Razi, Serapaz, C-21 Highsinger, and Embo. And this one actually got far enough into production that the full cast recorded all of their dialogue for these episodes. They never finished the animation, but those recordings of the cast exist, and so you can go online and see clips from these episodes that have been released at Star Wars Celebration events that show this really rough, unfinished animation along with the full performances from the cast. Cool. And we've got a little look at one of those here.
Looks like your little insurrection has failed. Now surrender, and I'll let your friends walk away.
I say, they give the kid his shot.
So that's it. Just you and me then. Boba Fett.
I guess it is.
How hard would it be to just finish up that scene?
I know.
It already sounds great, and it looks pretty good like that.
I was invested.
So Spring of 2013 wound up being a big time of transition for all of Lucasfilm, but especially for Lucasfilm Animation, because in addition to ending the Clone Wars, they had another series in development that they decided to shut down around the same time. It was one that had never aired, but was also very different to anything they had ever done before. So in 2009, inspired in part by the success of the Clone Wars and by the quality of Star Wars parodies that were being made by shows like Robot Chicken and Family Guy, George Lucas began developing his own Star Wars animated comedy, the result being Star Wars Detours. So Detours was announced in 2011. We learned that the Robot Chicken co-creators Seth Green and Matt Senreich would be the executive producers on the show, and they had hired a writer's room with people who had worked on shows like The Daily Show, Battlestar Galactica, SpongeBob, Buffy, Family Guy. Nice mix of comedy and sci-fi. But unlike Underworld, several episodes of Detours, a lot of episodes of Detours, in fact, were actually made, and the series was previewed to the public in 2012. So there is a trailer and several clips from Detours that you can still find online. And yes, of course, we're going to take a look at part of the trailer just now. If you've never seen anything from Star Wars Detours, get ready.
Yo, dudes, the Empire's pretty chill. Maybe you could, like, join me or something.
No, I left a message with your roommate, but your machine was full, so your landlord hung up on me when I was walking your dog because my homework ate it.
I got dressed for this.
Half dressed.
Put some pants on.
Hey, so, how's my nose look?
Oh!
Are you ready for the ribbon-cutting ceremony?
Man, will I be happy when we can stop pretending this thing's a mall?
This is no space mall. This is more like some kind of a Death Star.
Death Star. I like the sound of that.
Aha! This is a ploy! No. It's a ruse! No. It's an ambush! No. A subterfuge! No. A confining device! A snare? A box popped up on the stick! It's a trap! It's a wrap! Where's my hat? It's a trap! Sorry. Just finally figured it out. On my way back to the office. Couldn't get it out of my head. Gotta go. On double park.
Ow!
For luck. They haven't finished this chasm yet. I guess they went overboard.
So, as you might be able to tell from that trailer, the series would have been set between episodes 3 and 4, and it promised fans a look at, quote-unquote, what daily life was like in the Star Wars universe. Each episode would have featured 3 6-minute segments set at 3 primary locations: Dex's Diner on Coruscant, Jabba's Palace on Tatooine, and the still under construction Death Star, which, as we saw in the trailer, has the cover story that it's a space mall. Unlike Robot Chicken, though, the series would have been more than just one-off sketches. The characters would have actually grown and evolved and developed through the series, including the main stormtroopers who we saw in the trailer. They were voiced by Donald Faison and Breckin Meyer. And the series also would have brought back a lot of actors from the films to reprise their roles. Billy D. Williams recorded some new dialogue as Lando, Ahmed Best as Jar Jar, and Anthony Daniels as C-3PO, of course. Other characters that we would have seen in the series include a spoiled brat version of Princess Leia, a down-on-his-luck version of Old Ben, and a rebellious teenage version of Rada the Hutt. Still very much his own man, not his father. The crew ultimately produced about 39 episodes of the series, with scripts for 60 more that were written. But as we talked about, when Lucasfilm was sold to Disney and they decided to overhaul the slate of production on Detours was shut down and the series' release was put on indefinite hold. According to Seth Green, this was because Disney wanted to make sure that any new audiences that came into Star Wars through the new movies, that their introduction to these classic characters was quote-unquote sincere interpretations and not what he called Detours' deconstructive take. And for the next 13 years, that seemed to be it for Detours. That was the end of the story. The series just sat there in the Lucasfilm vault. But literally a couple of weeks ago, we got a follow-up to this story because at San Diego Comic-Con, Seth Green and Matt Senreich announced that select episodes from the show are actually going to be available to be seen at the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art when it opens next month in Los Angeles. So this museum that holds George Lucas's art collection, Star Wars and beyond, will also have a couple of movie theaters on site where people can go and see, among other things, select episodes of Detours. So in a way, it will no longer be an untold story starting September 22nd. So there's a common thread between these last three projects, is that in one way or another, they were shut down to make way for the sequel trilogy. But as we talked about earlier, Lucas was very adamant for a very long time that there would never be stories set after Return of the Jedi. So what changed? As we talked about earlier, the Grady Ranch project fell through, and that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for George Lucas. Beyond just the problems he was having getting Underworld made, he was also getting frustrated with his inability to get some movie projects that he was producing off the ground, things like Red Tails and Strange Magic. And so he was really getting kind of disillusioned and bitter with Hollywood and was contemplating retirement. And around that same time, Disney was looking to expand. And so Bob Iger approached him about selling the company. It's not clear when exactly in that process, if it was before or after, or when exactly it was that George decided to start working on the sequel trilogy himself. According to Iger's recollection, when the negotiations began, Lucas was initially kind of unhappy with the offers he was getting from Disney. He had seen what they had paid for Pixar and Marvel, which they had acquired in the last few years before that, and he felt that he should be getting a similar deal to what Disney had given Steve Jobs for Pixar. Now, Iger's response to this was Pixar was worth more because they had several movies in production at the same time as the negotiations were happening. And it was at this point that Lucas said to him, "Oh, did I not tell you that I'm making new Star Wars movies and I've got outlines for episodes 7, 8, and 9? At which point Iger rightfully asks, "Oh, can I see those outlines?" And Lucas said, "No." He eventually does, of course, agree to let Iger and a few other Disney executives read the outlines, but he's still very, very protective of them, even though they were included in the final sale to sell Lucasfilm to Disney for $4.05 billion. Crucially though, Disney was not under any legal obligation to make or to use those outlines to make the new movies, and as we know now, they didn't. So what do we know about George Lucas's idea for episode 7? Because again, he was so secretive with these scripts, or with these outlines, I should say, we don't really know a lot, but we do know that the broad strokes of the movie are kind of similar to what we saw in The Force Awakens. They at least begin in a similar place. Lucas's movie would have followed a young woman and a young man who are searching for Luke Skywalker, who had gone missing. The young man is named Sam in Lucas's outline, and he's described as being quote unquote pure charisma, while the young woman, she's described as being quote a loner, hothead, gearhead, badass, end quote. And she went through several different names as Lucas was developing his idea. Some of the names that he tried for this character include Thea, Taryn, Sally, Echo, and my favorite, Winky. Sam and Winky, of course, eventually evolved into the characters we now know as Rey and Finn. And they would have found Luke about halfway through the movie. Just like in The Last Jedi, Luke is hidden away at a long-lost Jedi temple. And in Lucas's outline, he's described as being kind of like Colonel Kurtz, Marlon Brando's character in Apocalypse Now. And Luke would have started training Rey/Winky and would have survived to the end of episode 7 and then still died in episode 8. Where the story diverges a lot more is where the villains are concerned, because Lucas wanted the main villain of the sequel trilogy to be Darth Maul. Even though he had killed him off in The Phantom Menace, Lucas had resurrected him for the Clone Wars and turned him into a galactic crime boss thriving in the underworld. And this is where we would have found him at the beginning of episode 7 alongside his new apprentice, Darth Talon. Darth Talon is a character you might have heard of because she first appeared in the Star Wars Legacy comics that Dark Horse published from 2006 to about 2010. Even though George claimed he never read the Expanded Universe, he did see a lot of the artwork from it, and he would occasionally pluck designs that he liked out of the comics and put them in his movies. That's how you wind up with Aayla Secura in the prequels, and it's basically what would have happened for Darth Talon, but in a much larger role, because it was Darth Talon who would have kind of instigated a lot of the action by recruiting the character who was codenamed Jedi Killer to the dark side. Jedi Killer would eventually evolve into who we now know as Kylo Ren. And it was from these concepts that the team working on The Force Awakens began. The art department created designs based on Lucas's material, some of which we've just seen. And the screenwriter Michael Arndt was working from Lucas's outline alongside Simon Kinberg and Lawrence Kasdan, who were consulting. But as the process evolved and as J.J. Abrams got on board as director, the story moved further and further away from Lucas's outline until they really only bore a passing resemblance to each other. And when George learned that his outlines were not really being used for the movies, he was very disappointed and decided to distance himself from the new films. And I think Lucas's reaction to these ideas is to his ideas not being used is relatable. We hear about all of these ideas that sound really exciting for Episode 7, The Clone Wars, Underworld, Detours, even Empire Strikes Back and Journal of the Wills. And it can be disappointing to think that we'll never actually get to see them. But it's also important, I think, to remember that Star Wars loves to revisit these forgotten ideas. And as we've seen today, a lot of these ideas do resurface. So we didn't see C.J. Thorpe and Mace Windu on adventures, but we saw plenty of Mace Windu in action. Luke's father doesn't tell him about his sister on Dagobah, but Vader does use the threat of Leia turning to the dark side as a sort of cudgel against Luke in Return of the Jedi. And even though we never saw Cad Bane training Boba Fett, that backstory still came into play in the book of Boba Fett and their showdown on Tatooine. So yeah, not everything can be detours, where we actually get to see it in something close to its original format. But you never know where these ideas may still turn up. So we probably won't get to see Darth Maul and Darth Talon take on Winky and Sam. But if we look ahead to the future, George Lucas's protege, he's now the president of Lucasfilm, and writing the next trilogy is one of the few people who did read George Lucas's outlines in Simon Kinberg. And if you've watched Maul Shadow Lord, you notice that there's a new Twi'lek with a red lightsaber in town who's working very closely with Darth Maul. So who knows what might still be in store for these ideas and where they could still yet reemerge. And with that hopeful and optimistic note, we're going to wrap things up for today. Thank you everybody so much for coming out. If you like what you saw, this is where you can find me online and we can keep talking about this stuff.
I don't think I'll follow you.